Try writing your name with your other hand right now, in your head if you have to. It feels clumsy almost instantly, doesn't it? Like your brain simply refuses to cooperate properly. About 9 out of every 10 people on Earth default to their right hand for exactly that kind of task, and that ratio barely changes no matter which country, culture, or century you look at. That kind of consistency doesn't happen by accident, and the real explanation reaches much deeper than simple habit. Roughly 90% of humans are right-handed, and that number holds remarkably steady across wildly different populations, from modern industrialized countries to isolated hunter-gatherer communities with no contact with the rest of the world. Even historical evidence backs this up. Ancient artwork, worn tool edges, and even skeletal where patterns from populations going back thousands of years show the same lopsided ratio. This isn't a modern cultural habit passed down through schools teaching right-handed writing. It's something far older and far more consistent than that. Here's what makes this genuinely strange. Almost no other species shows anything close to this level of population-wide handedness. Individual chimpanzees, for example, often do show a personal preference for one hand over the other, but across the species as a whole, that preference splits close to 50-50, with roughly as many lefty chimps as righty ones. Humans are a dramatic outlier here, with an entire species leaning overwhelmingly one direction. Whatever's driving this in humans isn't simply, some animals prefer one hand. It's something specifically, unusually skewed toward humans. Studying handedness in other animals took decades of careful, patient observation, since an animal reaching for a single piece of food doesn't reveal much about a genuine preference. Researchers like primatologist William Hopkins spent years running structured tasks with large captive chimpanzee populations, tracking which hand each individual used repeatedly across hundreds of trials involving reaching, tool use, and coordinated two-handed tasks. That large-scale, repeated testing is what eventually revealed the near-even population split in chimps, a pattern that held up consistently across multiple independent research groups and testing methods, which is exactly why it stands out so sharply against the heavily skewed human ratio. The leading explanation ties handedness directly to something else entirely: language. In the vast majority of people, language processing is concentrated primarily in the left hemisphere of the brain. That same left hemisphere also controls the right side of the body, including the right hand. One influential hypothesis argues that hand dominance may be a kind of side effect, the brain organizing its most demanding, most specialized task, language, into one hemisphere, and hand control simply riding along with whichever side ended up handling that specialization. This isn't just a loose coincidence either. Broca's area, a brain region central to language production, sits remarkably close to regions responsible for controlling fine hand movement, and some researchers argue these systems may share overlapping neural circuitry, possibly inherited from an earlier system built around manual gesture rather than spoken language. Under this view, before humans had complex spoken language, communication may have leaned heavily on hand gestures, pointing, signaling, and coordinated movement, and the neural real estate built for that gesture-based communication could have later been repurposed as spoken language took over, dragging hand dominance along with it as a kind of evolutionary leftover from an older communication system. This connection isn't purely theoretical guesswork either. Researchers studying ancient stone tools and fossil teeth have found physical evidence of right hand dominance stretching back well over 1 million years, long before any written record or artistic depiction could have told us anything about it. Scratch marks on fossilized teeth, left behind when early humans held food or hide in their mouths and used a stone tool to cut or process it with their dominant hand, show a consistent right-handed pattern across numerous specimens from multiple sites, where patterns on ancient stone tools point in the same direction. This wasn't a recent cultural development. It appears to be an ancient, deeply established trait, stretching back to some of the earliest tool-using human ancestors. The tooth scratch method deserves a closer look, because it's a genuinely clever piece of forensic science, essentially reading a million-year-old crime scene off a single fossilized tooth. When early humans gripped a piece of meat or hide between their teeth and sliced toward themselves with a stone tool, the blade would occasionally slip and leave a faint scratch directly on the tooth enamel. The angle of those scratches reveals which hand was holding the blade. Researchers examining specimens dating back roughly 1.5 million years found that the overwhelming majority of these scratches ran in the direction consistent with right hand use, giving a remarkably direct physical signature of handedness from deep in human evolutionary history. If right-handedness carries such a strong advantage, an obvious question follows. Why hasn't left-handedness disappeared completely over such a long stretch of evolutionary time? One compelling explanation, sometimes called the fighting hypothesis, points to physical confrontation. In any situation involving direct physical combat, a left-handed fighter facing a mostly right-handed population has a genuine tactical advantage, since opponents have far less practice reading and countering an unfamiliar angle of attack. Research into modern interactive combat sports, like fencing and boxing, has found left-handed competitors are meaningfully overrepresented at elite levels compared to their share of the general population. A pattern consistent with this kind of rare advantage affects keeping left-handedness from ever fully disappearing, no matter how strong the pressure toward right-handedness might otherwise be. The scale of that overrepresentation is bigger than you might expect. While left-handers make up roughly 10% of the general population, studies of top-level fencers have found left-handed competitors making up somewhere between a quarter and a third of elite rankings, several times higher than their share of the overall population would predict. Similar, though generally smaller, effects have been documented in boxing and other one-on-one combat sports. Interestingly, this advantage tends to shrink or disappear entirely in non-interactive sports, like swimming or long-distance running, where there's no opponent actively trying to predict your next move, which fits neatly with the idea that the advantage is specifically about facing an unfamiliar angle of attack rather than some general physical edge. It's worth being honest about how unsettled parts of this story still are. Handedness isn't controlled by one single gene passed down cleanly from parent to child. Twin studies show it's only partially genetic, with identical twins sometimes having opposite hand dominance despite sharing essentially identical DNA, meaning environment, development in the womb, and possibly even chance all play some real role too. Some researchers have proposed dozens of genes, each contributing a small, partial influence, rather than any single clean genetic switch. The language lateralization link, the fighting hypothesis, and several other competing explanations all have real evidence behind them, but no single theory has been established as the complete, final answer, and this remains an active area of ongoing research rather than a fully settled question. It's strange to think that something as small as which hand you instinctively reach with traces back over 1 million years, tangled up with the same brain systems responsible for language itself. Handedness isn't just a habit picked up in childhood from watching a parent or teacher. It appears to be a genuine echo of how the human brain organized itself around communication, long before anyone alive today, or anyone's grandparents, or their grandparents going back thousands of generations, ever existed. The next time you catch a left-handed friend awkwardly using a pair of right-handed scissors, or notice how clumsy your non-dominant hand feels trying to write, you're brushing up against a trait considerably older and considerably stranger than it has any right to feel in the moment. A habit as ordinary as which hand reaches for a coffee cup turns out to be tangled up with the deep history of how humans learned to communicate at all, a trait written into fossilized teeth over 1 million years before anyone thought to write anything down. That's exactly the kind of hidden thread this channel exists to dig up. If you want more of these, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.